One of the first signs an avoidant has mentally claimed you is subtle, but once you understand the psychology behind it, you can never unsee it. They stop treating you like an option. And for someone with avoidant patterns, that is not a small emotional shift. That is a structural shift in identity, behavior, and nervous system attachment. You have to understand something about avoidance. Their entire emotional strategy is built around maintaining escape routes. Freedom, distance, and emotional control are not preferences to them. They are survival mechanisms. Most avoidants learned very early in life that depending on people creates pain, disappointment, pressure, or emotional suffocation. So they adapt by staying emotionally self-contained. They keep relationships ambiguous. They avoid definitions. They give just enough connection to feel close, but not enough to feel trapped. That is why inconsistency is so common with them. One moment they are warm, attentive, and emotionally present. The next moment they disappear into silence, distraction, work, independence, or emotional detachment. And people misinterpret this as a lack of feeling. But often it is not the absence of feeling. It is the fear of what those feelings will eventually demand from them. But when an avoidant mentally claims someone, something begins to change beneath the surface. They stop managing the relationship like it is temporary. Their nervous system slowly stops preparing for exit. And instead of protecting distance, they begin protecting the connection itself. Now notice, they may never announce this dramatically. Avoidants rarely transform through emotional speeches. Their truth appears through behavior patterns. Suddenly, you are no longer chasing clarity every week. Communication becomes more stable. They begin considering your emotional reality before making decisions. They start showing up when it matters. Not perfectly, but consistently enough that you can feel the difference. And this is critical because consistency is sacrifice for an avoidant. Every act of reliability challenges the identity they built around emotional independence. When they text you back without playing games, when they check on you without being forced, when they make room for you in their routines, they are doing something psychologically significant. They are allowing another human being to matter. That is huge for someone who spent years convincing themselves they did not need anyone. You also begin to notice they become more protective of your place in their life. Not necessarily possessive in an immature sense, but intentional. They stop leaving the relationship exposed to uncertainty. They begin reducing emotional competition. They make it clear through actions that your role is different from everyone else's. Why? Because once an avoidant emotionally invests, they do not experience attachment casually. They experience it as risk. The deeper the attachment grows, the more terrifying the possibility of loss becomes. So if they are willingly creating stability with you, it means the relationship has become more valuable than the safety of detachment. And this is where many people misunderstand avoidance completely. They assume love is proven through emotional intensity. But with avoidance, love is often revealed through behavioral consistency, through effort, through presence, through the willingness to stay engaged when their instincts are telling them to retreat. Anybody can give you words in moments of emotion. But when an avoidant starts reorganizing their life around keeping you emotionally secure, that is not surface-level attraction anymore. That is attachment becoming real. And the fascinating part is this transformation usually happens quietly. There is no grand announcement inside them. One day they simply realize your absence would disturb the structure of their life. Your presence has become emotionally integrated into their identity. You are no longer someone they enjoy. You are someone they unconsciously account for. That is when the relationship stops being casual in their mind. Because when an avoidant truly claims you, they stop protecting themselves from the relationship and start protecting the relationship from the world. And that changes everything. Another powerful sign an avoidant has mentally claimed you is this. They start letting you see the parts of themselves they normally spend their entire life hiding. And if you truly understand avoidant psychology, you realize how enormous that shift really is. Because avoidants are not emotionally detached in the way people think. Most of them are emotionally guarded. There is a difference. Detachment suggests the absence of feeling. Guardedness suggests the presence of feeling that has been locked behind protection mechanisms for years. An avoidant learns very early that vulnerability feels dangerous. Maybe they grew up in environments where emotions were ignored, criticized, punished, or dismissed. Maybe they learned that depending on others created disappointment. So they developed a psychological survival strategy: control exposure, suppress needs, and never let anyone gain enough emotional access to truly hurt them. That is why so many avoidants appear calm, independent, and emotionally self-sufficient on the surface. But underneath that surface is often a person carrying enormous unspoken tension. They are managing fear constantly. Fear of losing control, fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of being emotionally consumed by another person. So what do? They curate themselves. They show you the intelligent version, the composed version, the funny version, the capable version. But they hide the insecure parts, the lonely parts, the emotionally needy parts. They hide their jealousy, their fears, their shame, their childhood wounds, and the inner chaos they rarely admit even to themselves. Because exposure creates attachment, and attachment creates vulnerability. But when an avoidant mentally claims you, something remarkable starts happening. The mask begins to slip, not because they are weak, but because your presence starts feeling safer than their isolation. And this is where you must pay attention carefully. Avoidants rarely become vulnerable all at once. Their nervous system does not work that way. Vulnerability emerges in fragments, in unexpected moments. They might suddenly tell you a painful story from childhood they never share with anyone. They may admit a fear they normally hide behind confidence. They may confess insecurity, emotional confusion, or guilt they have carried privately for years. To most people, these moments may seem small, but psychologically they are massive acts of trust. Why? Because for an avoidant, vulnerability feels like surrendering emotional control. And emotional control is the very thing they built their identity around. Understand this deeply. Avoidants do not reveal their inner world to people they see as temporary. They protect themselves too carefully for that. If they are exposing emotional truths to you, it means your role in their mind has changed. You are no longer just someone they enjoy being around. You have become someone psychologically significant enough to risk emotional exposure with. And what makes this even more fascinating is that many avoidants do not fully understand they are doing it. They may still claim they are fine. They may still resist labels or emotional conversations, but their actions betray the deeper reality. Their subconscious is already moving toward connection, while their conscious mind is still trying to maintain safety. That internal conflict is important to understand, because avoidants often experience love and fear simultaneously. The closer they feel to you, the more they want connection, and the more terrified they become of needing it. So when they open up despite that fear, you are witnessing something rare, a person choosing intimacy over emotional self-protection. And here is the deeper philosophical truth most people miss. Vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is the collapse of performance. It is the moment a human being stops managing perception and starts revealing truth. And for avoidants, truth is incredibly difficult because truth removes distance. But once they allow you to see the parts they hide from the world, the relationship changes permanently. Because now they are emotionally invested in how you perceive them. Your acceptance begins healing wounds they spent years trying to outrun alone. That is why these moments matter so much. Not because they suddenly became emotionally perfect, but because they trusted you enough to stop pretending they were untouchable. And when an avoidant stops hiding their inner world from you, what they are really saying is this: you are no longer outside my walls, you are inside them. One of the clearest signs an avoidant has mentally claimed you is when your absence starts affecting them more than their pride. And this is where the psychology becomes deeply revealing, because avoidants are masters at protecting pride. Pride, for them, is not arrogance in the traditional sense, it is emotional self-preservation. You have to understand that avoidants survive through emotional control. They regulate discomfort by distancing themselves from vulnerability. When conflict appears, they withdraw. When emotions intensify, they create space. When attachment deepens, they often suppress their own needs so they do not feel dependent on another person. Their instinct is always the same: regain emotional control before closeness becomes overwhelming. That is why silence is such a common language for avoidance. Silence gives them power. Distance gives them regulation. Emotional detachment gives them the illusion of safety. And for a long time, this strategy works. They convince themselves they can live without needing anyone too deeply. They tell themselves independence is strength. But then someone enters their life who disrupts that emotional structure. And suddenly, the silence that once protected them begins working against them. When an avoidant has not emotionally claimed you, distance is easy for them. They can disappear, distract themselves, redirect their focus, and emotionally compartmentalize the relationship. But when they become deeply attached, something changes internally. Your absence no longer feels peaceful. It feels destabilizing. Now notice, they may still try to act unaffected. That is important to understand. Avoidants often experience emotions privately before expressing them outwardly. So externally, they may appear calm, controlled, even indifferent. But internally, the nervous system is reacting very differently. They start noticing your absence in everything. The silence becomes louder than usual. Your change in energy becomes impossible for them to ignore. A delayed response affects them more than they expected. They replay conversations in their mind. They become unusually attentive to emotional shifts between you. And the fascinating part is this often confuses them because they are not used to another person having that level of psychological influence over their internal state. That influence is the key. Because avoidants fear emotional dependency more than almost anything. Dependency represents vulnerability, uncertainty, and loss of control. So when they realize your absence can disturb their peace, challenge their focus, or emotionally affect them, they are forced to confront a truth they have spent years trying to avoid. They care more than they wanted to, and this is where pride and attachment begin colliding inside them. Part of them still wants to maintain control. Part of them still wants to avoid looking needy, emotional, or vulnerable. But another part, the deeper human part, starts craving reconnection. That is why you often see avoidants behaving in contradictory ways when they are serious about someone. They pull away emotionally, but then come back unexpectedly. They act distant, but monitor your reactions closely. They try to appear unaffected, but become visibly unsettled when they sense you detaching emotionally. Why? Because now the relationship matters to them psychologically. And once an avoidant becomes emotionally invested, losing the connection no longer feels abstract. It feels personal. This is also why emotionally mature silence affects avoidance so powerfully. Not manipulative silence, not games, but genuine emotional withdrawal rooted in self-respect. When you stop chasing, stop forcing, stop trying to manage their emotions for them, they are left alone with their own attachment. And for avoidants, that can be profoundly confronting, because without distraction, they finally feel the emotional weight of what you mean to them. And here is the deeper philosophical reality underneath all of this. Human beings can suppress expression, but they cannot permanently suppress attachment. Eventually, emotional truth rises to the surface. Eventually, the heart exposes what the ego is trying to hide. That is why an avoidant who has mentally claimed you begins struggling more with distance than they ever expected. Their pride still wants control, but their attachment wants connection. And over time, the relationship becomes the battlefield between those two forces. But the moment your absence starts affecting them more than their ego protects them, everything changes. Because now they are no longer running from connection. They are running from the fear of losing it. And those are two completely different things. One of the most profound signs an avoidant has mentally claimed you is when they begin including you in their internal future. And this matters more than most people realize, because avoidants are not naturally future-oriented when it comes to emotional commitment. In fact, many avoidants psychologically survive by staying focused on the immediate present. Why? Because the future implies permanence. It implies responsibility, emotional continuity, and the possibility of deeper dependence. And for someone whose nervous system associates attachment with pressure or loss of freedom, thinking too far ahead can feel emotionally threatening. So avoidants often keep relationships psychologically compartmentalized. They enjoy moments. They enjoy connection in controlled doses. But they avoid mentally building a life around another person because doing so increases emotional risk. The more integrated you become into their future, the more devastating it would feel to lose you. That is why many avoidants unconsciously resist long-term emotional imagination. They may avoid labels, avoid deep conversations about where this is going, or keep parts of their life separate from the relationship. Not always because they do not care, but because fully imagining permanence forces them to confront vulnerability they are not prepared to carry. But when an avoidant mentally claims you, something extraordinary starts happening beneath the surface. Their internal language changes before their external words do. Suddenly you are no longer temporary in their mind. And you can hear this shift in subtle ways if you pay attention carefully. They start naturally using words like we and us without forcing it. They reference future experiences with you, included automatically. A concert months away, a trip next year, plans during holidays. Small, future-oriented conversations that once would have triggered discomfort now begin appearing organically. This is psychologically significant because avoidants do not casually build emotional permanence into their thinking. Their mind only does this when attachment has become deeply rooted. And here's the fascinating part. Often they are not even fully conscious of the shift at first. The subconscious mind always reveals attachment before the conscious mind admits it. That is why avoidants sometimes surprise themselves with how naturally they begin factoring you into long-term decisions. They may suddenly consider your schedule before making plans. They may think about how certain career choices affect the relationship. They may begin introducing you more intentionally into different parts of their world. Why? Because emotionally, you are no longer existing outside the structure of their life. You are becoming part of the structure itself. And this changes everything internally for them. Because once an avoidant begins imagining a future with someone, the relationship stops being casual psychologically. It gains emotional weight. Now there is something to preserve, something to lose, something that matters beyond the present moment. This is where many avoidants begin experiencing internal conflict more intensely than ever before. Part of them feels drawn toward deeper connection, but another part becomes terrified by the magnitude of what they are feeling. Because the future creates attachment, and attachment creates emotional exposure. Understand this clearly. Avoidants are often far more affected by attachment than they appear externally. The difference is they process it internally rather than dramatically. While anxious people externalize fear through pursuit, avoidants internalize fear through overthinking, withdrawal, and emotional control. But despite that fear, when they are serious about someone, the future keeps pulling them back toward connection. And this is one of the strongest indicators of genuine emotional investment. Because people do not unconsciously build futures around individuals they are emotionally indifferent toward. The mind naturally protects energy from uncertainty. So if an avoidant is mentally placing you into their long-term world, it means your emotional significance has surpassed their instinct to remain detached. Philosophically, this reflects something deeply human. We only imagine permanence with people who change our internal experience of life. The future becomes meaningful when another person's presence begins shaping our identity, our choices, and our emotional sense of home. That is why this sign matters so much. It is not about grand romantic speeches. It is about psychological integration. It is about the moment someone stops seeing you as a temporary experience and starts seeing you as part of their unfolding life story. And when an avoidant begins including you in their future without fear overpowering the vision, what they are really revealing is this: you are no longer just part of their present. You have become part of who they are becoming. One of the most undeniable signs an avoidant has mentally claimed you is when they begin fighting their own nature to keep the connection alive. And this is where the difference between casual attachment and serious emotional investment becomes impossible to ignore. Because the truth is, avoidants have predictable escape patterns. The moment intimacy becomes too intense, expectations increase, or emotional vulnerability deepens, their nervous system reacts as if danger is approaching. They feel overwhelmed, trapped, emotionally exposed, and their instinct is almost always the same: create distance. Sometimes that distance looks physical, sometimes emotional, sometimes it appears as silence, distraction, work obsession, emotional numbness, or sudden detachment. But underneath all of it is the same psychological mechanism: self-protection. This is important to understand because many people mistakenly believe avoidants do not care when they pull away. In reality, the withdrawal often happens precisely because they care. The deeper the attachment becomes, the more activated their fear becomes. Intimacy starts challenging the identity they built around independence and emotional control. But here's where everything changes when an avoidant has truly mentally claimed you. They stop obeying every instinct to run. Now, does that mean they suddenly become emotionally perfect? No. They may still struggle. They may still withdraw temporarily during stress or conflict. They may still fear vulnerability. But there is now effort where there used to be escape. And effort is everything. Because for an avoidant, effort represents internal conflict. It means part of them wants safety through distance, while another part values the connection enough to stay engaged despite discomfort. That tension is psychologically profound. You begin noticing that even after disagreements, they return instead of disappearing permanently. They attempt conversations they normally would avoid. They push themselves to explain emotions they do not fully understand yet. They stay present during uncomfortable moments longer than they used to. Slowly, imperfectly, but intentionally. Why? Because attachment is beginning to outweigh avoidance. And that is an enormous transformation. You have to remember, avoidants spent years training themselves not to rely too heavily on anyone. Their independence became armor. Their emotional distance became identity. So when they begin challenging those patterns for the sake of a relationship, they are not simply changing behavior. They are confronting the entire psychological structure they built to survive. That is why this process often looks messy. Growth is rarely elegant. Sometimes they move toward connection and then panic afterward. Sometimes they express love indirectly because direct emotional expression still feels overwhelming. Sometimes they try to maintain closeness while simultaneously fearing it. But the key difference is this: they no longer want the relationship to fail simply because vulnerability feels uncomfortable. That is maturity beginning to emerge inside attachment. And philosophically, this is one of the deepest forms of love a human being can experience: the willingness to confront oneself for the sake of connection. Real love is not the absence of fear. Real love is choosing connection despite fear. That applies especially to avoidance. Because every time an avoidant communicates instead of shutting down, every time they return after conflict instead of disappearing forever, every time they choose honesty over emotional hiding, they are fighting years of conditioning. And most people never appreciate how difficult that battle truly is. Understand, avoidance is not just a dating style. It is often a lifelong nervous system adaptation. It was built through childhood experiences, emotional disappointments, unmet needs, and learned self-protection. So when an avoidant begins resisting that instinct, not because they are forced to, but because losing you feels worse than vulnerability, that is one of the clearest signs the attachment has become deeply real. Now, this does not mean you should tolerate unhealthy behavior endlessly. Effort must become consistent over time. Growth must become visible. But when you see an avoidant genuinely attempting to stay emotionally engaged even while struggling internally, you are witnessing something meaningful. You are witnessing a person slowly choosing connection over fear. And that choice changes the entire relationship dynamic. Because the moment an avoidant starts fighting for the bond instead of fighting against intimacy, the relationship stops being a threat to their freedom. It becomes part of their healing. And that is when love stops being temporary emotion and becomes transformation. One of the final and most revealing signs an avoidant has mentally claimed you is something very few people understand correctly. They quietly become emotionally territorial about you, not always in loud, dramatic, or controlling ways, but in subtle psychological ways that reveal just how deeply attached they have become. And this is important, because avoidants are usually associated with emotional distance, independence, and detachment. People assume they are unaffected by closeness, but the reality is far more complicated. Avoidants often suppress attachment externally while experiencing it intensely internally. You see, when an avoidant is emotionally uninvested, they maintain separation naturally. They keep emotional exits available. They do not monitor the relationship closely because psychologically they are still prepared to detach if necessary. But once they mentally claim someone, the emotional dynamic changes completely. Now your attention matters to them. Your emotional energy matters to them. Your availability matters to them. And suddenly, they become highly aware of anything that threatens their emotional significance in your life. Now, this does not always appear as obvious jealousy. In fact, avoidants often dislike overt emotional displays because strong emotion makes them feel exposed. Their territorial behavior is usually quieter, more psychological, more restrained. They may become noticeably attentive when someone else gets too close to you emotionally. They may subtly seek reassurance about their place in your life without directly asking for it. They may react to emotional distance more strongly than before, even if they try to hide it behind calmness or indifference. Why? Because attachment has now activated fear of loss. And this is the paradox of avoidant psychology. The very people who spent years convincing themselves they did not need anyone often become deeply affected once they truly attach. But instead of expressing that fear openly, they attempt to manage it internally. That internal management creates fascinating contradictions. They may act detached while simultaneously paying close attention to your behavior. They may pretend not to care, but notice every shift in your tone, your energy, or your availability. They may avoid emotional conversations, yet feel deeply unsettled when they sense emotional disconnection from you. Because once an avoidant mentally claims you, your role in their emotional world changes permanently. You stop being external. You become psychologically significant to their sense of stability. And this is where many avoidants begin confronting emotions they are not fully equipped to express yet. Possessiveness, fear, attachment, protectiveness, insecurity, all the emotions they spent years suppressing start surfacing beneath the surface. Not because they are weak, but because human attachment eventually bypasses emotional defenses. Understand this clearly. Emotional territoriality is not always unhealthy. In its mature form, it reflects emotional investment. It reflects the desire to preserve something meaningful. The problem only arises when fear turns into control. But in healthy form, this protectiveness simply means the relationship has become emotionally valuable. And for avoidance, emotional value is not given lightly. This is why an avoidant who has mentally claimed you often becomes more intentional about maintaining the connection. They may not suddenly become verbally expressive overnight, but their awareness of losing you intensifies. They start realizing your presence is affecting their emotional equilibrium in ways they cannot easily dismiss. That realization changes them internally, because now they are forced to confront a truth avoidants spend years trying to escape. Attachment creates vulnerability, but it also gives life meaning. Philosophically, this is one of the deepest transformations any human being can experience. The shift from self-protection to emotional investment. The shift from isolation to connection. The shift from controlling emotions to risking them. And what makes this especially powerful with avoidants is that their attachment is rarely impulsive. When they finally allow someone to matter deeply, it usually happens after enormous internal resistance. That is why their emotional protectiveness carries so much psychological weight. It means the walls did not simply crack. Someone became important enough to walk through them. And once that happens, the avoidant is no longer just protecting themselves from pain. They are protecting the connection from loss. Because when an avoidant quietly becomes afraid of losing you, what they are really revealing is this: you are no longer someone they can emotionally replace. You have become someone they cannot emotionally ignore.